But let me introduce Ajamu Baraka, who is a human rights defender whose experience spans 4 decades of domestic and international education and activism. Baraka is a veteran of grassroots organizer whose roots are in the Black liberation movement and anti-apartheid and Central American solidarity struggles. How are you doing? He is an internationally recognized leader of the emerging human rights movement in the U.S. and has been at the forefront of efforts to apply the international human rights framework to social justice advocacy in the United States for more than 25 years. As such, he has provided human rights trainings for grassroots activists across the country, briefings on human rights to the United States Congress, and appeared before and provided statements to various United Nations agencies, including the UN Human Rights Commission, which is a precursor to the current UN Human Rights Council. Baraka is a geopolitical analyst, organizer, writer, human rights defender, and veteran of the U.S. and Pan-African Black liberation movement with over 50 years of work in the U.S. and internationally. Currently, Baraka is the national organizer of the Black Alliance for Peace. And if anybody wants to get linked in with the Black Alliance for Peace, we have a sign-up sheet at the door. So if you want to get emailings and things like that, please sign up. And was a candidate for Vice President of the United States on a Green Party ticket in 2016. Baraka serves on the Executive Committee of the U.S. Peace Council, leadership body of the United National Anti-War Coalition, and the National Steering Committee of the National Black is Back Coalition. He is an editor and contributing columnist for Black Agenda Report, and is the recipient of the Serena Sherm Award for Uncompromised Integrity in Journalism. In 2019, Baraka was awarded the U.S. Peace Memorial's Peace Prize. If we could, let's give it up for our panel of conversations.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's really not. This is Ajamu's time to shine. I'm just facilitating some questions and might have some clapbacks. But I'm very excited to hear what Ajamu has to say tonight about peace, Black liberation, and human rights, and their intersections. So to make the best use of your time, we'll just hop right in. And I'm a political theorist, so I like to start with definitions. So I wonder, Mr. Baraka, if you can start by just telling us how you define peace and Black liberation and human rights, and then offer a little bit of a narration of the relationship between them, especially in the context of the global order that arose after the Second World War.
Wow. Okay. Well, before I jump into that very important question, let me, if I can have a couple of minutes just to kind of provide a bit of a context, I think, for why we're here.
You can have several minutes.
Thank you. First, let me thank everybody for coming out this evening, this cold, windy evening, or at least it's cold to me, from where I live at, and to be part of this conversation. I'm really honored also to be in this space that symbolizes the kind of struggle that Detroit is known for, the kind of working class, radical fight back, resistance and transformational politics that this city is known for. And I'm really honored to be here, to be in this space. You know, this is a very a critical moment in the life of this country, and really globally. We are immersed in a politics of irrationality, a politics that does not seem to be able to address the pressing needs of the people and the contradictions that this system has created. The politics that are hegemonic today are politics that are stuck in the past. And because of that, because we have a politics and a ruling class, a ruling element that's unable to rule not only in the same way, but unable to provide any kind of leadership to address these contradictions, we are facing a very precarious situation here in this country. A situation so serious that the reality is that we don't know if we will be here in 2 weeks. When you look at this situation in Ukraine and how it has escalated, and the inability of the quote-unquote collective West to find ways to de-escalate, you see the same kinds of phenomenon that we've seen in other historical periods, where rhetoric would drive policy to the point where basically you have conflict that becomes inevitable. The issue we have today, of course, is that a conflict between the collective West and Russia could very well end up in a nuclear catastrophe. So this notion that, we're going to be making plans for next year or even next week is something that has to be challenged. We have people who are basically oblivious to what is probably the most dangerous moment in this country's history, more dangerous than some of us who have lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. But because people are completely oblivious, because of the role of the media in diverting people away from this serious moment, we're not seeing the kind of public pressure for a resolution of this conflict, for a resolution of the warmongering policies of this state. And the consequence is that the ruling class believes that they have a free hand to pursue their aggressive policies that are meant to try to perpetuate their hegemonic position globally. And for all of us, that means that we are facing what we consider to be an existential threat. So this conversation tonight is a conversation that's meant for us to grapple with some of these issues, both in terms of theory, but also in terms of practice. Because we understand we've got to build effective alternative power. We've got to build new movement. We have to have the capacity to take this moment into our own hands. And that means affirmation of the absolute historical necessity to build organization, to be absolutely clear in our politics. So starting off with these terms is very important. Being clear about what we mean by these terms is important, because we say in the Black Alliance of Peace that time out for obscuring the realities we are facing, that we can't sugarcoat the moment, that we have to have clear politics, and we have to say where we are going with our politics, with power and conviction. So, the terms. And with all of this, now you have to repeat that question.
Yes. So, let's start with peace. Do you mean kumbaya? Do you mean holding hands and pacifism when you say peace? What do you mean by that?
Well, I'm glad that you raised that. That's a very important concept. The Black Alliance of Peace is an alliance for peace. But we're not, we don't believe that peace can be achieved by just changing consciousness. We are materialists, and we understand the kind of contending interests that we know are vying for hegemony, vying for the ability to continue to exploit. We understand that there are structures that are responsible for the kind of warmongering and the absence of peace. And that's why we embrace a clear conception of peace that actually was pulled together by a dear colleague who asked this question, Dr. CBS, who went back and took a look at the kind of agitation that came, the African or African-American activists were raising at the end of the Second Imperialist War in 1945, when we were raising issues around colonialism and national oppression in the U.S. And understanding that the anti-colonial movement and the anti-capitalist movement had to be consolidated, and that this drive toward war and warmongering was a challenge to all of us in our ability to live peaceful lives. And so they constructed what Dr. CBS identified as the Black radical peace tradition, a tradition that said that peace is not the absence of conflict, but it is the understanding that in order to have peace and social justice, we had to address the structural contradictions, the structures that were perpetuating conflict. And what are those structures? Colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, capitalism. That if you are committed to patriarchy, if you are committed to peace, you have to be committed to dismantling those structures of oppression, those structures of violence. So for us, that is the Black radical peace tradition, one that puts us on the side of struggle, puts us on the side of revolutionary transformation. And that is the guiding light that we have in the Black Alliance for Peace. So we work with organizations that are committed to what they call peace. These are very good people who take a moral position, believe that people can be convinced to be peaceful, and that's all right. We go further though. We say that we're not going to convince the Joe Bidens and Barack Obamas and the Republican Party and the neoliberals and the Democrat Party that they should just, hold hands and what's that word?
Kumbaya.
We understand that these people are being driven by objective interests, and that if we want peace, we've got to take power from them.
All right, so next is Black liberation. Like, what do you mean by this? Liberation from what and to what end?
Well, the way my understanding of Black liberation is that first, when we talk about Black, we have to also differentiate that for me and for the Black Alliance for Peace, we center the interests of the Black working class. We see ourselves as members of the Black working class. We see ourselves as a population that's been colonized in a special form of colonialism here in this territory we call the United States of America. And so we understand that if we're going to address our objective situation of being an oppressed, exploited population, then we have to again defeat those elements, those forces, those class forces, those national forces that are responsible for our oppression. And in making that recognition, we also understand that we have a responsibility and an opportunity to build common relationships with other oppressed and exploited people and classes, so that the program then becomes a program of building a revolutionary movement to take power from the exploiters. So there's not Black liberation without the liberation of all people who are exploited and oppressed. But we center ourselves within our own African realities. We commit ourselves to the building of independent African power in order to ensure that we can advance our particular interests and to make sure that whatever revolutionary process is developed, that the interests and the perspectives and the values and the history of our people are not only represented, but in the leadership of that process.
And then we have human rights. And this gets a little bit tricky because, as we know, so especially in the context of the United States, there has been so much war and imperialism that has been waged in the name of so-called human rights. And so often human rights is used as a means to legitimate intervention and the abrogation of sovereignty and self-determination. But when you use human rights, what do you mean by that?
Well, we also bring in, like the radical peace tradition, these structural elements. That for us, human rights means developing the ability of the people to be able to realize human dignity. We say that you can't have human dignity if you don't have the ability to feed yourself. That if you don't have housing or adequate housing, that if you don't have the opportunity to develop yourself through education, if you don't have health care or the ability to live in a clean environment. So these are things that confer dignity. And we say that ability to live in dignity should be our individual and collective right. Now, what prevents us from living dignified lives? Again, we identify the structural enemy. The liberal conception of human rights is this sort of amorphous notion of we all have rights, and they've been sort of passed down from God to the rulers, and that those rights are primarily individual. And then things like housing and these other kinds of elements are not really rights. But the real rights are the ability to have free speech and to vote and all that. Important rights. Okay? But we say that's not enough. That for us to live in dignity is the center of that. And that we identify those elements that deny us the ability to live in dignity. And we say it's the pan-European, colonial, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. So we don't see human rights as something that's amorphous, that's neutral. We see human rights as something that is reflective of power relationships. That for us to be able to realize human rights, it means we have to put a break. We have to put a break. We have to defeat those powers, that state that denies us the ability to realize our human rights. So that's why we say our conception is one in which we put the people at the center. Not the legal framework, not even the United Nations and all of the UN treaties, as important as some of those treaties are. We say that for us, the people are the centerpiece, the people are the source of human rights. The people determine the range of human rights. That is, what are human rights? Okay? And we say that determination comes out of the people's struggle. We determine what the range of human rights are. The people are the source of legitimacy in terms of human rights. So our people-centered concept of human rights is very different from the liberal conception of human rights. We don't play like it's neutral. We say that people-centered human rights are revolutionary human rights. And that the only way we're going to be able to realize those human rights is through revolutionary struggle, taking the state and building a new society.
All right, so we got peace, we got Black liberation, and we have people-centered human rights. How are these things related? And then you mentioned the Second Imperialist War, what we call the Second World War. What is that sort of post-war war? How does the relationship between these relate to that post-war global order that arose?
Well, these are some of the concepts that were produced out of the Black radical tradition. That some of our leading Black radical intellectuals and organizations were grappling with the new realities that we were facing post-1945. And so these concepts, these struggles are the result. That when we talked about the Black radical peace tradition, and now we're talking about the Black radical human rights tradition, that's what the people-centered human rights framework is. You know, we went back and we looked at this at the practice, and we gave it a term. We saw how the African American organizations saw the possibilities of raising the contradictions in the U.S. and globally with the issue of colonialism, that they saw that could be raised more effectively in this new structure that was created in 1945. What was that structure? The United Nations. The United Nations that theoretically had committed itself to human rights and to peace. So they saw that this was an opportunity to raise these issues, especially within the context of the growing competition between the U.S. and the West, and of course the Soviet Union. In that competition, these ideological contradictions that the West had, the West pretended to be the champions of democracy and human rights while they were systematically killing and maiming Black people in the U.S., while Western powers were involved in killing and maiming in order to try to reassert their colonial power at the end of 1945, to reestablish their empires. So they saw this as an opportunity to raise these kinds of issues, to sharpen the contradictions, to provide new tools for us as we were organizing a resistance movement in the U.S. and as the anti-colonial movements were taking shape and becoming more powerful. So these are the practices people engaged in. In the U.S., the struggles were framed as struggles around human rights. The NAACP issued a stinging critique of U.S. practice in 1947. Before that was the National Negro Congress that issued a critique of U.S. practice to this new formation called the United Nations. In 1951, the Civil Rights Congress said, we charge genocide in terms of U.S. practice as it relates to African people in the U.S. So these were the practices. The framing of our struggles was a human rights struggle. You know, but something happened in the U.S. around this issue of human rights because of the competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union and other emerging powers, by this time the Chinese, were raising issues within the U.S., pointing out the human rights contradictions within the U.S. The U.S. policymakers started to try to shift the discourse. You know, as Malcolm said, and he said 10 years later, when you talk about human rights, you're talking about an international perspective, okay? What the U.S. propagandists, state propagandists did, or were successful in doing, as a consequence of both repression and other kinds of maneuvers, they shifted discourse from human rights to what? Civil rights. They domesticated it. They took the power out of it. They disconnected it from the global struggles for justice, the global struggles for transformation, the global anti-colonial struggles, okay? So that by 1955, with the Montgomery bus boycott, the call was for civil rights, constitutional rights, as opposed to the new treaties that have been developed within the UN that was supposed to provide fundamental human rights to people, okay? The reason why the U.S. abandoned this concept of human rights, it started in the United Nations as a consequence of the agitation from African Americans, from those petitions that were submitted, and the kind of sensation that was created. So these are the practices that we saw, and we label these as the radical human rights tradition, the radical peace tradition. Because again, we understood as Black radicals, black radical internationalists that this was the correct route to go. This was the practice of our people. African people in this country have always been internationalists. It's no mistake that this is the birthplace of the Pan-African movement. Garvey and his movement that was involved with anti-colonial struggles around the world. Okay? You know, African people went to Spain and fought against fascism. We mobilized when the Italian fascists invaded Ethiopia. We always understood and were quite clear about what fascism was because we understood it because we lived it. The colonial situation in the South was straight up fascism, colonial fascism, okay? So we've been quite clear about that. That there's a distinction somewhat with European fascism, okay? And that's supposed to be the concern that people have today, you know, and trying to lecture us on what fascism is, but we understood it. So these struggles are the things that help to develop the frameworks that we operate from today. The black radical peace tradition, the black radical human rights tradition. These are the things that are connected up with all of these terms we've been talking about, black liberation and people-centered human rights and peace. And it's a framework that we're using today to understand the challenges of today and to mark out a vision. And we say again, there's no space for reform. We can win and we struggle for reforms. There's no question about that. But you win reforms through struggle. You win reforms when you have the ability to force concessions from the enemy, okay? But we don't get stuck at the level of reforms. We understand that for us to ultimately solve the issues that we are faced with, we have to have revolutionary change in this country. We have to have a socialist revolution in this country. And we absolutely clear about that.
This guy gets it. Okay. And you know, when you're talking about fascism, people like Aimé Césaire and C.L.R. James and George Padmore understood that fascism is the term that Euro-Americans use when they start getting treated like the colonized. And that emanates from a particular black radical conception of what the actually existing structures of fascism are. All right, so you mentioned internationalism. And I just wondered, can you talk about the importance of internationalism in the struggle for peace, black liberation, and people-centered human rights, and specifically what the role of the black working class is in the internationalist struggle?
Yeah, well, everything we've been talking about is defined by an international perspective. But to be even more clear, that international perspective is one in which we recognize that we're not going to be able to address the issues that we face within the U.S. without understanding the connection of those issues and structures to the global structures of oppression. An international perspective recognizes that we are part of a global system, that this global system developed beginning in 1492, when Europeans spilled out of Europe and began the process of conquering the Americas. And then supplemented that with the labor of Africans from what became the African continent. That process created Europe. That process is the process that created the enormous wealth that we see in Western Europe and the underdevelopment of peoples and nations in the so-called global South. So this reality is a reality that we are facing today. And that that understanding is what drives our ability to not only define what we are up against, but also to define our friends, allies, and our enemies. That we define ourselves as a people who are exploited because of capitalism and colonized, then we have the ability to build alliances with other people who are exploited and colonized. That is the international objective of our movement. the recognition of our common humanity, the recognition of our potential common political objectives. So we say to people, this perspective, this international perspective that we talked about a few minutes ago, they have defined the Black radical tradition, is something that has to be revived. Because part of the politics we see in this country today is this tendency to be focused just on the national, just on the specifics of an African people or Latinx people or whatever. And that's all framed to basically to fragment us and keep us confused. And we all have particularities that have to be dealt with, there's no question about that. But the challenge for us today is building those transnational, if you will, connections, those political relationships that will allow us to concentrate our power, both in the US and globally. So for us, internationalism is primary. It has to be brought back into the public discourse. It has to be part of the radical and revolutionary consciousness.
Wait a minute. Eggs are hella expensive here. People are homeless, and people's sort of local conditions are deteriorating. So how do we get people to understand, as Malcolm X said, that you can't understand like Mississippi without understanding the Congo when people's material conditions locally today, right now, are so bad? So how do we link, let us say, the Africa Command and the 1033 program, or the training of police forces here by the Israeli Defense Force with the struggle in Palestine? Like, how do we actually get people to see materially, concretely, those relationships when they're struggling day to day to just exist?
That's a very good question. You know, in the run-up to the conference out in California that established the United Nations, there was a recognition among our people that again, there was an opportunity to raise our issues. But there was also a recognition that our issues weren't necessarily unique to us. And so across the country, there were meetings among Black folks. And this was across the board, the Deltas and the AKAs and the National Association of Black, everybody was meeting. And what they were doing was talking about how these issues can be linked up. There was a certain kind of sophistication among folks at that time, partly fueled by the Pan-African movement, fueled by the Garvey movement, fueled by the pervasive Black radicalism. And so there was a certain kind of sophistication that was there among the masses and among the activists. Today, our challenge is to redevelop that kind of understanding. And so the first phase of this is targeting the activists, the people who are trying to engage the activists and the organizers, the people who are trying to engage the people who are trying to build organizations, to help to elevate their understanding of these connections as part of the struggle that we face. Because if they understand that in their work with the masses, the ones who really don't work, mass-based work, then that will help the people to begin to make those kind of challenges, those kinds of connections. And it's understandable that people wouldn't have that understanding right now. Because as you said, people are going through hell here. And we have never had this level of disorganization among our folks, ever, okay? And so we say, as we're doing this work, we have to start though with the local, start with the local and the national, and help people to make that connection. You can't understand what's happening you can't understand why you have these pigs in Memphis beating Tyree Nichols to death. Unless you understand that this is a manifestation of white power and that this is an expression domestically of the same kind of conditions, the same kind of practices that the U.S. state is involved in on the African continent. With the establishment of the U.S. Africa Command, both are committed to the perpetuation of white imperialist power, okay? So it was a godsend that these pigs in Memphis were in fact black. So we can begin to deal with the confusion about the nature of this state and the nature of this domestic army that we call the police force. That objectively, this force is in place to protect and advance white imperialist power, okay? So we make those connections. We talk about the fact that along with these folks who are beating us, they have these enormous amounts of military-grade equipment. How did they get it? Well, because they have a program called the Department of Defense 1033 program that allows for all of this surplus military hardware that they've been using in the imperialist wars to then be transferred to the domestic army, that we call the police, across the country. And when you have these police forces with all of these armaments and with no accountability, then you're going to have the kind of militarized activity we see across the country with these SWAT teams that are out of control, with the killings by the police, okay? With domestic protests happening, and then the police show up with tanks and armored personnel carriers and all of the things that you see normally in a war situation. Why? Because they're at war. We just don't realize that they make a war against us. So we have to make these kinds of connections. We have to talk about the fact that we are in fact at war. And be absolutely clear about that. Right now it's a one-sided war, but our responsibility is to change that equation. So we start with the domestic. We make these connections. We ask people, why is it that eggs are so expensive? And food in general. Might it be related to the sanctions that were slapped on the Russians when the U.S. Created that situation with this proxy war in Ukraine? Is it, you think the fact that we can't have public housing built might be related to the fact that there's $858 billion being devoted toward the Pentagon? These are the kinds of issues we have to raise. Why is it that no one has raised hell and no one has gone to prison as a consequence of the disproportionate number of African people who died as a consequence of this COVID pandemic? We have to raise these kind of issues so people understand what is at stake here. That we can't, have decent schools because our resources are being taken from us, stolen from us, and transferred into the pockets of the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. You go out and you voted for the Democrats and Joe Biden, people are raising the slogan, defund the police, and Joe Biden and the neoliberals
said no.
No, and
refund the police.
Refund the police.
More.
And the Negro politicians are right with him. And not only did he say it, they transferred last year $37 billion to the police forces. And what's the response? We still want to, vote for Democrats. And you ask the average person, why are you voting for Democrats? Well, they can't even tell you. It's habit, familiar. Oh, and those crazy Republicans. All right, okay. All right. We say that we against the duopoly, that both of these capitalist parties are the enemy. They represent sectors of the same bourgeoisie. One, the transnational bourgeoisie based in the U.S., and the other, the national bourgeoisie.
As Julius Nyerere said, the U.S. is a one-party state, but in typical U.S. excess, it has two. Okay, well that was a bummer. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about power. You mentioned the term dual power earlier, And so can you just say a little bit more about what that is and how we build it to contend with the state, but also how do we sort of respond to the state's reaction to any building of power, not least the militarization and increased funding of the police, which we know are occupying forces. Because we know historically, anytime that Black people have any modicum of power, especially economic or political power, this is what causes or causes spike in white backlash, right? So for example, Ida B. Wells, as far back as the 1890s, she knew that lynching, the primary causes of lynching were economic progress, economic prosperity. It was not that Black men were raping white women, that was just propaganda. It was economic success, any modicum of Black self-determination. So on the one hand, how do we build dual power? What is that? And then how do we protect it? How do we defend it?
Well, we say we have to build dual and contending power, meaning we have to build our capacity to begin to address our material needs, to begin to be able to advance our political interests, which means we have to build more effective organizations. We can't just depend on the electoral process. We can engage the electoral process, but it has to be from an organized position, okay? So we put pressure on the state to provide the material needs that the people have, but at the same time, we build the capacity to address those material needs ourselves. We can talk about defunding the police and argue for expelling the police, but if we're not building the capacity to take full control of public safety in our communities, then we just bullshit, and the people know it. Okay? So we have to build the ability to be independent, to be able to advance our interests, while also simultaneously contending, engaging the state, increasing our fighting capacity to defend and ultimately to defeat the state. Because as you said, Dr. CBS, the enemy is not going to allow you just to begin to build independent power without attempting to undermine that ability.
Look at Haiti.
Yes.
Yeah. Haiti is still paying for taking their power.
Yeah, so we have to build the ability to be able to defend ourselves also. We say in Black Lives of Peace that the self-defense is a human right, and that we have a right to defend ourselves. We have a right to struggle for self-determination, a word that we don't talk about much anymore. That basically one of the successful things that the enemy was able to achieve, beginning with the intensification of the counter-revolutionary process in the 1970s, was to undermine a sense of peoplehood among African people in the U.S. Now, I'm using these terms interchangeably: Black, African, African American, where we all are talking about the same people. Okay, that basically what they wanted to do was to individualize us, to make us individual, quote unquote, American citizens, if you will. Okay,
Foundational Black Americans.
so we don't think of ourselves as a people anymore. So what occurred, in my opinion, Dr. CBS, was the retaining of race as a category, but the elimination of ethnicity. Because what is ethnicity? It's cultural, correct? And so by making us Americans, they not eliminated, but they definitely they definitely undermined our ability to see ourselves as a people. And there's people in this room that remember, simultaneous to the intensification of the Black Liberation Movement, what was happening among our people. The Black Arts Movement, the ability Black people redefining themselves and their relationship to this state and to this society. Who's talking about Black culture today?
Beyonce. She just won Hella. She has the most Grammys, doesn't she?
Which is really reflective of where we are today. So So yeah, we are in a very, very precarious situation because they have been successful in that process of individualizing us. And so no one talks about self-determination, self-reliance. Okay? Well, if we don't have that, we're not gonna have anything. Because you have some people in this, even among the radical movement here in this country, who are still under the illusion that if there's gonna be a revolution, it's going to be a revolution in which the white left runs it, controls it, and that we are reduced to participants. But participants will have to find our way into the center of this thing. That ain't gonna happen.
So representation is not going to save us?
That is this process.
Okay. I have something I can say about ethnicity, but I'm gonna keep it moving. I want to get to audience questions, so I'll just ask one more question. Can you speak a little bit? So you mentioned the counter-revolutionary forces that arose in the 1970s, basically in the context of neoliberal globalization, deindustrialization, all of these economic processes. Can you speak a little bit more about the new Black class structure that also arose and how intra-racial class dynamics play into all this, what one might call the buffer class or even the neo-colonial forces, right? And you reference it somewhat in terms of talking about how those Black pigs in Memphis were upholding white supremacy, right? So how does neo-colonialism and neo-colonial forces and buffer class forces in our community also impede the internationalist working class struggle?
Well, these are the forces that begin to take shape and begin to actually win some degree of local power in the 1970s. I look at, for example, what I see as bookends to the corruption of Black politics. In 1968, Dr. King was murdered as part of a movement that was unfolding in Memphis among the sanitation workers. People around Dr. King did not want SCLC to be closely associated with that, but Dr. King had the vision and foresight to understand that the struggle had to be moved toward the economic phase. That's why he was trying to organize the Poor People's Campaign, and he went to Memphis. That position and his opposition to Vietnam put a target on his back. He was murdered. 1973, we have the election of the first Black mayor in Atlanta, Maynard Jackson. In 68, ASME was the union that was at the forefront of the sanitation workers' strike that Dr. King was a part of. Everybody was mobilized and they supported that. 1973, Maynard Jackson comes to power. First thing that happens is the sanitation workers, they call for an increase in pay. It was rejected. They go on strike. The Black mayor and his Black administration, what do? They break the strike. Okay? So here you have this Black mayor in 1973 taking on and defeating the sanitation workers. To me, it's symbolic of the kind of class politics that were developing. This is a year after Gary. You know, the very famous gathering of Black folks that came together in Gary, Indiana, and mapped out a route of engaging the electoral process. And so in the 1970s, that began to unfold. You had these Black mayors coming into power. You had a simultaneous ideological thrust by the state to incorporate us psychologically and emotionally into the U.S. state. All the stories about Black progress and all of this, all with the intent of what I call the Americanization of the African. Okay? By the 1980s, that process was taking hold. And with the introduction of the neoliberal fight back, But that was really started with the famous Lewis Powell memorandum in 1971 that encouraged the bourgeoisie to fight for the interest against the revolutionary forces. You had the beginning of the neoliberal phase. And that really began to take hold under the Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan era in the 1980s. The ideological opposition coming from the black liberals and the emerging black petty bourgeoisie was non-existent. They were consolidating their power. They used their positions in these states to do these set-asides that resulted in an expansion of the black bourgeoisie in cities across this country until they got stopped, until the white folks got tired of what they saw as corrupt politics. Even they had been doing it for decades and put a stop to it. But at that point, you had enormous power had been transferred using the state to this expanding black bourgeoisie. You had an expansion you had the affirmative action programs in the late 1970s, in which corporations were bringing in people into their fold as part of their contribution toward a more perfect union. And so you had the expansion of the black petty bourgeois class. So that today, that class, not only do you have this existence of this class, you also have a class that has been disconnected physically and psychologically from the masses, from the people. So not only are they a buffer class in the sense of playing that buffer role, many elements of that class actually hate black folks, in particular black working class folks. Yeah. And so this is the new reality. You have a petty bourgeoisie and a bourgeoisie that at one point were dependent on the black community. That's how they emerged as a class. When I grew up on the south side of Chicago, the doctor I went to was a black doctor. The dentist people went to were black dentists. Everything I saw on the south side of Chicago was in fact black. Okay? All the teachers and the people who owned the stores and all of that, they were dependent materially on the black community for their class position. With the transformation of the economy and the incorporation of these elements, you got folks who are, executives and all this kind of stuff, and they are dependent on the black community for their position, but on the white power structure, on white capitalism. Okay, so you have the buffer class, the professional, managerial, administrative class that run these cities across the country, playing the role of buffers and managing the natives. You have all of these other elements who are in the economy now, who are working for Fortune 500 companies. They live in their own little enclaves, they live outside the communities. It's been when we talk about the black community today, what are we talking about? Because it's been completely transformed. So these are the elements that we have to deal with today because they are the ones who are on the front line against us. We can't get to the bourgeoisie because we got this buffer class in between us. And so we say today, we've got to identify this buffer class as a principal aspect of the primary contradiction. We can't get to the primary contradiction, the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois system, because we can't get past this bourgeois and petty bourgeois class that's there. We say we got to identify them as a class enemy and be clear about that, unapologetic about that. Okay? You side with the enemy, you're the enemy. I almost cursed. We don't care what how you look or you identify yourself, okay? That's got to be clear. That's why we got to be very careful about all this, the black community this and the black community that. Now you got to define what you're talking about. Whose interests are you upholding? Okay? I don't give a damn about some first black this or whatever. What interests are you upholding? Folks got tricked, by this Obama freak. You know, this. I mean, he was the worst thing that ever happened, in my opinion. The worst thing ever happened to African people in this country.
I thought the worst thing he ever did was wear a tan suit. Didn't he tell me he did more than that?
That was bad also. It was bad because he couldn't explain it.
But he can play basketball.
Yes. he was so alienated. He wouldn't explain to white folks. He was rocking that suit. Explain to them, this is what we do. You know. Anyway, so. But this is where the process of the Americanization of the African really consolidated under Obama. You know, we all remember. We'll see a story about some international situation, some upcoming conflict or whatever. And if you didn't know anything about the combatants, the two sides, you know, I'm still simple this way. All I want to do is ask, what side does the U.S. support? And whatever side they supported, I knew I needed to support the other side. Okay? That was the instinctual knowledge of our people. We was always suspicious of anything we saw coming from, quote unquote, the man. But what happens when the man becomes one of us? Mass confusion. You know, you look up and now the man is attacking the most prosperous African country on the continent, Libya, and getting away with it. And black folks talk about, oh, that damn Gaddafi, yes, he needs to go. What do you know about Gaddafi? You know? So you have this kind of reactionary politics being consolidated under Obama. It was the Tea Party that busted Obama in 2013 when they were getting ready to strike a deal. I think they were striking in a few months in terms of imposing austerity.
The TPP.
That it was the Tea Party that busted because the Obama and the Democrats had agreed to cuts in Social Security and in Medicare. Okay? And wasn't nobody gonna say anything about it until the Tea Party said, oh, well, wait a minute, what's this? And that backed them up. You can't run the kind of politics that you could run under an Obama and now a Biden without massive opposition, unless you run it under these kind of freaks and the people are like sleep. If some of the things that they have run successfully were run by a Republican, there'd be mass opposition. We still looking for where to the Build Back Better that they were going to pass. You know, here Biden it takes a position of bragging about the fact that he helped to negotiate that settlement between the railway owners and the workers. They had no sick
busting.
Yes, you know, and now people talking about sick leave and what happened to sick leave for the rail workers. What happened to sick leave among most of the workers in this country? But this is the kind of politics that we have. If that was a Trump that would have talked about, bragged about that agreement, people would have been up in arms. You know. So these are the folks we've got to call out. That basically we're not clear about the enemy, that we're going to be confused, and we're going to allow people to be confused.
But what about the horrors of socialism? Just one of y'all. All right, so there's much more we can talk about, but I definitely want to open up the conversation to the audience. So we'll pass this mic around. So if you have any questions, keep them thorough but concise. Decolonize the mic, as I like to say. Q&A, not U&A. So do we have any questions? Okay, let's go here and then here. Brown jacket, then vest.
All right, cool. So I'll start off with a real quick one. Y'all talked a little bit about the formation of like a buffer class / petty bourgeoisie type vibe or whatever. And I was wondering if there's like any literature that kind of explores that topic, I guess from, you mentioned like late 60s, early 70s up until the election of like Obama and even up until now. So if y'all got anything on that, any recommendations?
Well, I'm going to defer that to Dr. CBS in terms of specific literature. We know and we understand the phenomenon. And there's some pieces that have captured some of that.
Well, so what Ajamu described is a sort of recent enunciation of the historically dependent nature of the Black middle class as such. And somebody like Harold Cruz actually explains this quite well as E. Franklin Frazier, Black bourgeoisie. In terms of the post kind of 1980s phenomenon, Manning Marable covers this a bit in How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, which was published in 1980. But I also recommend that you read Black Agenda Report. Glenn Ford has been on they ass since that thing launched in 2009. Glenn Ford has been on the Black Men's Leadership class. Ajamu is also a contributor. Bruce Dixon, that if you actually read this form of media, they have been describing this phenomenon and calling out, they were calling out Obama when it was not popular. Now it's cool. You know, now that Obama ran with the bag, now it's cool to be anti-Obama. But before it was cool, the Black Agenda Report was calling it out. So I highly recommend reading articles from that site. Did you have another question? No, okay. It was this gentleman.
I want to say Robert Allen too.
Yes. But that, okay.
You ran for vice presidency on the Green Party, and I'm wondering, now that you had this experience, how you view the third party, whether it's Green Party or Working Class Party or whatever, as a mechanism for social change.
Good question. I still believe that there's spaces that can be exploited within the electoral process. But as I said in 2016, there has to be approached in a certain kind of way. You have to have an independently organized party that recognizes that in order to participate in the electoral process, it has to be from an organized position. I don't support these individual candidates who have no accountability to any organization, any community running in the electoral process. They can do it. But to me, there's no accountability there. So if you're going to participate in the process, it has to be from an organized perspective, okay? But you also have to be sober in terms of what can actually be achieved. You can't build a process and a campaign and suggest to people that you're going to transform their conditions. You got to be clear that this electoral thing is just one aspect of an overall project of building resistance, of building movement. You don't put all your efforts and energy into the electoral arena. That is backwards. It's not going to take you any place. So I believe that these spaces can be exploited. I think that one of the demands that need to be made in this country is to expand this bourgeois democracy, because there's no democracy, and that was empirically verified in 2014 with that very famous case. Investigation by Martin Gillis and Benjamin Page that demonstrated empirically that the U.S. is an oligarchy and not a democracy. So putting demands on the system, calling for and developing radical people-centered democracy is one of the demands we have to have among ourselves. And not perpetuate the myth that these procedural processes of voting every 2 or 4 years actually represent democracy, because they don't. And we see that when the system or the state is prepared to move, it doesn't matter what kind of vote took place. We just discovered today that in Jackson, Mississippi, they haven't passed yet, but legislation has passed in one house in which they're going to develop a different alternative district in Jackson with an expanded police force controlled by the Capitol Police Force in Jackson, Mississippi, undermining the judges in the main judicial district, with these appointed judges by this white Supreme Court judge. We here in Michigan, we all remember you living through it, when they basically showed you what democracy meant when they took over your city and took over every major city in this state when you had significant numbers of black folks. And people talk, well, we voted for these folks. They're like, we don't give a damn about your vote. This is about power. Okay? So we engage the system, but we engage in understanding its contradictions. So I believe in that. I believe that we raise the issue of the control of these two parties legally across the country, and making it impossible for people to engage. Look, what was the issue that became so popular right after 2016 that was championed by AOC? What was the policy sheet they wrapped here around? The Green New Deal. Now, we remember in the Green Party what Mean Jill ran on. The Green New Deal. Okay, I don't necessarily believe in a new deal, because I don't think there's any more deals that we have with capitalism. But it was something that was an agitational piece, but it showed the potential we have, because they stripped out the elements that we were pushing, and in terms of militarism and the fossil fuel industry, and AOC ran with it. And what happened? It took off. So it shows the potential of that agitational model. If we would have got on the debate stage in 2016, I'm not saying we would have won, but it would have been a different kind of politics. Okay? So, we got to make those kind of demands that if there's going to be democracy, it has to look somewhat like democracy. And right now, it's nothing but bourgeois democracy.
All right, I have a lovely question.
Yes, sir.
You said in reference to black liberation that race, basically saying that race was an absurdity, and you kind of moved over to ethnicity, and it almost seemed that it was like liquidating the nation. How can you be internationalist? And I'm an internationalist, but how can you be an internationalist if you're just an ethnicity? But more than that, when we look in the framework of the United States, are we pursuing socialism for America? Does that mean the liquidation of the black nation? And is black a legitimate identity? Because it's a color and it's associated with this absurdity called race? Like I said, it's a loaded question.
Oh, no, it's a good question. And it allows me to clarify if there's any confusion. What I referred to, my brother, in terms of the counterinsurgency and counter-revolutionary process that intensified in the 1970s, was the objective by the enemy to, in fact, liquidate the national question. You liquidate the national question by doing what? Liquidating the people. Ethnicity it defines a people. It defines a culture and a history. As African people in North America, we have legitimate positions on advocating for self-determination. Okay, as a people, a collective consciousness. The enemy was able to erode that. Okay, so I'm describing a process that I believe in, and for me, I don't go as far as identifying or characterizing race as absurdity. Of course, racialization became an absurdity because it doesn't objectively have to exist, but it does exist, and we got to deal with that. So what happened was they kept this notion of us as black people, as individuals, race, whatever that's supposed to mean, but black people as a potential nation, a collective recognition of our collectivity, of the potential of us building an independent national movement that was severely undermined by the enemy, in my opinion, in the 1970s.
most exercise I've gotten in a while.
Dr. Baraka, it's an honor to be here with you. In the beginning, you really captured the cynicism of the current moment in regards to this imperialist war against Russia in Ukraine and the inevitability that people perceive it. And I guess I felt really paralyzed by that. I think a lot of people do. I'm wondering how you think we can break that cynicism and that sense of an inevitability of sleepwalking towards a world war and of continuous escalation, and also what lessons we can learn from the successes and the failures of peace movements of the past. Thank you.
We have to make sure that we agitate among ourselves, that we demand that representatives don't allow themselves to give legitimacy to this war effort, that we agitate among our friends, that we elevate this to the level of importance that it should have, that we don't go along with this assumption that not only will there be public support for the continuation of this conflict in Ukraine, but you see how they're conditioning the public to engage in a conflict with who else?
China.
China.
Wait, China got spy balloons though.
Exactly. I mean,
Balloons.
so they these are not our enemies, but these are the ones who they have identified in their documents. They're committed to what they call full spectrum dominance. You see, they don't even hide it. It's part of their national security strategy. They said we're committed to full spectrum dominance. That's dominance across the board. And one aspect of that is any regional power, for example, that is in a position to threaten U.S. regional interests, they have to be targeted and eliminated. That's why they got rid of Libya. That's why they targeted Venezuela. Okay? That's why they even targeted Ethiopia. People got confused because we came out in opposition to the war in Ethiopia, because the Ethiopian state is a neoliberal state. Okay, but we recognized that what the U.S. was doing was because of Ethiopia's drifting toward China, its development of the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam project, its growing economic power, its size, that the U.S. wanted to see them cut down. So they, work with the TPLF, their, sort of on the ground neocolonial force to undermine the Ethiopian state.
And Eritrea, the only country on the continent.
And to undermine
with Africa.
Exactly. And so we came out opposed to that. People like, but this Ethiopians, they're not revolutionary. Well, we anti-imperialists. Right. And we look constantly at the international balance of forces. And we don't want to see any situation develop that strengthens our primary enemy. So, and this is not a bad position, it's an Ajamu position. It would be an absolute travesty if the collective West were in fact to win in Ukraine. These freaks would, there will be no stopping them. There will be war with China, okay? It will strengthen the Western powers. And that's not going to happen, because everybody who knows a little bit about military strategies and this and that, who follow this, and some of us follow this religiously, okay? The war was the special military operations was just that. It was a special military operation. They could have been resolved in the first month. In fact, they were moving toward resolution in Istanbul until the Biden administration told Boris Johnson to tell the Ukrainians to slow up on this. We're not ready to have a resolution of this because we want to believe the Russians. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but basically that this was a war that they had planned out for 8 years. They were concerned that under Trump, he was going to undermine the plan. He did slow it up to some extent, but Trump did make one critical decision. That is that they started shipping heavy equipment to Ukraine, something that the previous administrations had been reluctant to do because they knew this was crossing a red line. Everybody knew it. Kissinger knew it. Everybody talked about this. Everybody who was honest knew these folks were playing a dangerous game. So they slowed up a little bit under Trump, but they gave them more time because they built the most formidable army in Europe outside of Russia. And so once Biden came into power, he gave the green light to Zelensky in March that, hey, we're going to let you all take back the Donbass and take back Crimea by force. So the plan was in place. So to allow this to happen, what Russia's fooled in different ways, because it wasn't going to be contained in Donbass. They made it a broader war. But my point is this. There's no way that we can allow these folks to win this conflict because they would be prepared now then to march on to China. And that would be a threat to all of us. It's not even, the situation right now with Ukraine is dangerous enough because they have put themselves in a rhetorical, they're painting themselves into a rhetorical corner with this. We're always going to support Ukrainians and that the resolution of this is victory for Ukraine. It's not going to happen. So what happens? They have to escalate, and then they've been escalating to the point that it's such a dangerous place now because what comes next? Because the spring offensive has already started. And all they have done now with their policies is to compel the Russians now that instead of stopping, on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, they're going to have to march to Kyiv and actually engage in regime change. So the result has been basically Ukraine no longer exists. Don't be fooled, okay? They have, Zelensky has sold off, they've allowed the Western powers to come in, buy up some of the best land. They're selling off public assets. They are in debt that they can't pay back. It doesn't exist anymore, and they know it. So we can't allow our people to be mobilized to support the agenda of the bourgeoisie in Ukraine, in China, any place. And we got to be clear about that and not worry about the repercussions. We had to think about stuff, for example, tonight in terms of some security protocols. Because of the positions that we take on Ukraine, we get threats all the time, and they're gonna run over here in Detroit, but you got to think about it, because they want everybody to toe the line. Right? We can't allow that to happen. So that's what we do. We got to agitate. We got to, with power and conviction, express our opposition to the imperialist project.
Okay. I think we got time for one more.
But before I'm at the break.
Oh, brief intermission, another bathroom break. So I will just chime in here. And for people who think that the conflict in Ukraine has nothing to do with Black people or African people, what we see now is an escalation of aggression toward the African continent, up to and including sanctions against particular African countries that have relationship with the Russian military. As well, early on, in terms of the economic ramifications, there, because of histories of colonialism and neo-colonialism, so many African countries are monocrop economies, are single commodity economies, and so they are relying upon places like Ukraine for grain, right? For very, very basic foodstuffs. And so when those things are unavailable, if you think that we're suffering now because of $7 eggs, imagine what's happening in developing countries, right? In countries that are wholly dependent on foreign exports. right? On foreign imports, excuse me. So this affects all of us, right? So when a few months ago, or a few months after the war was just starting, so many people were saying this is a European war, a white people's war. But as we know, imperialism conscripts everybody, racialized people, colonized people into the war. That's why wars between Europeans become world wars, right? That's why they're called world wars, when they are waged by European peoples, because racialized people and colonized people bear the brunt. So it's just something to keep in mind. So anyway, what y'all watching? That's good.
Maybe we could throw out this question, Sharice, and then, there we go. Here.
Okay, he's back.
All right, peace, y'all. Happy to be here with everyone. Thank you for being in this space with us. You mentioned 1951, we charged genocide, and I'm wondering if you're familiar with the International Tribunal that was held in October of 2021. We still charge genocide. Your thoughts on this important event, maybe some of the outcomes if you're familiar, and the People's Senate, which is being formed, not based off of our current so-called Democratic Senate, but yeah.
That was a Jericho movement, right?
Yeah. No, I'm very familiar with it, and I think it was a marvelous event to help to re-raise that issue, and to re-raise the role of internationalism.
And censor political prisoners.
And exactly. And so, we're familiar with some of the outcomes and the efforts being made now. I still believe it's important to publicize it more. There's an effort right now that you're involved in, right?
Mm-hmm. The international law.
Talk a little bit.
So this is so in terms of the October Tribunal, the United States was found guilty by an internationalist cohort of every single charge of genocide. There are 5 main charges of genocide that included violence against political prisoners, healthcare, ecological degradation. So there are 5 main forms of genocide the U.S. was found guilty of. Currently underway is the International Tribunal Against Sanctions, which is holding 14 hearings. I think there's 14 hearings that are to cover sanctions in 14 countries, from Eritrea to Palestine, Zimbabwe. We just had one in Zimbabwe, Syria. And the Syria sanctions have become particularly important in the context of the huge earthquake that just hit Syria and Turkey, and the inability to wage effective rescue because of sanctions, because of lack of access to vital commodities, to vital supplies, right? And so the International Tribunal Against Sanctions is really important because for many reasons. One is to change the discourse around sanctions from the term sanctions to unilateral coercive measures. Sanctions really distort what's actually happening. The overwhelming majority of sanctions in this country, and there's like 60% of the population of the world is under sanctions, come from the United States. This is a violation of international law. So one aspect of the tribunal is to simply hold the United States accountable to international law, which prohibits these unilateral coercive sanctions. Number 2, to emphasize that sanctions are an act of war. That at a certain point, direct intervention became untenable, so sanctions became a way to foment and facilitate regime change up to and including color revolutions, right? And thirdly, is to really interrogate in general international law itself, because international law was not constructed in a democratic fashion. Even organizations like the United Nations came about when most of the world was still under colonial domination. So what does it mean to hold the world accountable to a set a form of jurisprudence that comes out of a colonial and imperial situation? And so even as we're using bourgeois international law to hold the United States accountable to what it agreed to do, there's also a broader interrogation of the issues with that framework itself. But we encourage you to read up on sanctions, on the International Tribunal Against Sanctions, because sanctions do kill, right? Period. They are never in the interest of democracy. They're never in the interest of human rights or women's rights or any of those other discourses. They are solely meant to influence regime change. And even when they're ostensibly only against a few individuals, they ultimately hinder the government from being able to administer particular services, to be able to run their government the way they see fit, which means that all sanctions are sanctions against the people. And again, this is in violation of international law. So I can go on and on, but that's what we're doing now. The hearings will be held between now and late July, culminating with the tribunal that will take place in person in Caracas, Venezuela. So tap in.
I think we got time for one more.
Okay. That's just Charles. Charles.
Okay, on a slightly different note. So in terms of defunding the police, like, what is your solution to that? So if the police were defunded, or you support defunding the police, like, what would be the next step?
Well,
Be nice.
yeah, I understand the sentiment around that demand. But when I look at the context of how that emerged, that is right in the first few weeks of the George Floyd protests across the country, and that demand emerged a week before the day of action that was being scheduled, calling for the community control of the police. That defund demand was rolled out like a campaign. It started with a op-ed in the New York Times. There were all kinds of materials that had already been produced calling for defund the police. And the effect it had was that not only did it preempt a slogan that would have been much more difficult for the bourgeoisie to respond to, and because it's difficult for how do you frame opposition to the people who say we should control our own public safety process?
The same way they did to the school boards in the 1970s. What do you mean?
Well, they could do that, but the conditions today are such great that they have been exposed in such a way it would have been much more difficult for them to justify opposition to the community controlling their own public safety. That could be framed and was framed as a democratic right. But it's very easy for them to confuse and obscure this defund the police slogan. And they did. It reduces things to just this sort of policy kind of struggle. And it provided ammunition for the state to say, you all want to get rid of the police. And people say, right. But then you have people in the communities, and they knew this to be the case, across the country who weren't prepared to get rid of the police, especially when it was quite obvious the radical forces had no ability to engage in the control of public safety in their communities. So it became an instrument. It backfired, in my opinion. It became an instrument to not only de-radicalize a radical moment, but it became an instrument that even the Joe Biden and the Democrats were able to use to further legitimate the state. So I never did support that slogan. I don't even support the idea that some people advocate who call themselves so-called abolitionists, because if you don't, you can't extract out the police and the prison system from the state. If you're not talking about defeating the capital state, then I think you're kind of bullshit. Nobody, who's gonna, this is the front line of their defense forces. The domestic army, we call it police, the prison system, where they can lock us up, they're gonna just automatically or voluntarily dismantle that for what? Because we don't like you. So for me, this is the kind of phony politics that has emerged here in this country. And people can posture as though they're militants because I'm an abolitionist. What does that mean? Abolish the state. Abolish the state. Direct your attention on the state. Dr. CBS.
Okay, if I'm being a little bit more diplomatic. Number one, people come to consciousness and people become radicalized over time through all sorts of campaigns, whether it's feminism, abolitionism, particular environmental or ecological concerns. And so there's always room for people to move from abolish prison or abolish the police to abolish the state. Now, I would say, if we just say abolish private property, you effectively wouldn't need police. If you abolish private property, you effectively wouldn't need police because police are occupying forces that are meant to keep people locked into where they ostensibly belong and locked out of where they don't belong. This is all predicated on private property. This is why when you hear anything about so-called riots, human life is discussed always directly alongside property damage. So that would be the slogan, we're gonna abolish something. And then the state, I suppose, right? But I think that these discussions need to be had between community control of the police, abolish the police, and defund. Because even defund and abolish are not the same thing. But what we do know is that we have models for community control. If you look at what the Black Panthers were doing and the police patrols, that's a form of community control of the police, not because the police came from those communities per se, but because the communities held those pigs accountable. And there's actual data that shows that brutalization and murder of people in those communities in Oakland, in Richmond, and even in Vallejo, which is, Vallejo is of a particular ilk. The murders and brutalization went down dramatically because people in those communities were holding those police accountable, right? And that's just one step. But I will say, it's not just about community control of the police. We need community control of all of these institutions, the institutions to which the majority of our people are subjected or funneled into, up to and including schooling, right? And so I think that what happens is when we get so stuck on one thing, right? When we have such a narrow frame, what can happen is, number one, the means become the end, and number two, it's much more easy to co-opt a sliver of the problem and have it backfire, as Ajamu described. But for those of you who are abolitionists, like, we don't want no smoke. But just, and I just want to, people have to start somewhere, and I just want to reiterate, I have hope that people whose work and organizing is around abolition, that broader things can, will be pushed to be abolished under their politics. So, suspended an olive branch. Don't add us.
All right, let's give them both a hand for a wonderful talk. Thank you, gentlemen. Really appreciate your work. Thank you all for coming out. Hope to see you all again.
Okay, thank you so much.